the scoping side of things is definitely a challenge. And I think as we've started helping people originally, as we were waiting for CMMC to spin up, we were doing a lot of consulting work, and almost everybody started trying to do their entire enterprise. They wanted to come in, let us know where we stand. We want CMMC level 2 certification, and we want to apply it everywhere. And I understand why we want to go there is people don't want to worry about where the data was going to be. They didn't want to think about it being on this computer or this server. Or where. Let's just make sure everything's ready and everything's in scope. And it's like, okay, well, we start there. And about halfway through the process, people began to understand it's like, oh, this might cost a little bit more money than we want to spend. Like, yeah, you could. So the next logical thing was like, well, how do we reduce that scope? How do we start isolating where that CUI is? We start to understand along with the customer, how do you put it in only certain servers? Who's actually authorized to see CUI? It's not everybody in the organization. Great. Let's start narrowing it down to those people. So very quickly, we started helping them understand, and now we see it in the assessment side of things is like, okay, what machines are in scope? What are your actual CUI assets? If you're not familiar with it, there is a scoping guide out there that you can go find, and we can put it, I'll go throw a link to that in the CMMC tools over here. The CMMC scoping guide can actually lead you through what are the different assessment categories. And one of the things we see people do is either underscope or overscope it, and they don't have enough of the CUI assets tagged, or they've put everything as a CUI asset. The other thing they may not identify is what is a CUI asset or what is out of scope, or what are their security protection assets. That's another important category we see misunderstood or misidentified, where they haven't labeled or included in their asset inventory or their data flow diagrams their antivirus product, their patch management system, their actual authentication systems. Are they using Active Directory, or are they using Microsoft GCC Hive? We'll talk about those later. And Azure, and Enter ID for those. So all of those security protection assets and making sure they're in there, those are also very important to include in your scoping guide. Another one we see I think not used enough is contractor risk management assets. These are assets in your scope that could be part of your network that are recognized by you as the OSC as they could be used to access CUI, but they're not authorized for it, is one way to think about it. So that could be somebody's computer and shipping. And these are not required to be physically or logically separated at level 2 from the rest of the network. So you can have contractor risk managed assets that are not authorized from CUI. You don't need to go through the steps of actually separating them out, but you do need to label them appropriately in your asset inventory, and you do have to have them listed out there. Another one is your OT, your informational and operational systems. You do not need to put all your machine tools in there. They will be another category. You do want to list them, but they will not be assessed in the same manner as everything else. We use that asset list as really the guide for the rest of your assessment. So knowing what you have scoped is really critical to kind of kicking that out and knowing where that goes. And if it's listed as out of scope, we're not going to be there. And if it's listed as a security protection asset, we're only going to look at those controls which pertain to that, whatever that control set is. So if it's antivirus, we're just making sure that product does what it's supposed to do for antivirus. If it's doing patch management, we're just going to look and make sure it's patching machines. That's all we're looking at for those systems. Another thing we want to make sure we understand is what's inherited controls and making sure those are documented in your scoping. So if you're using a managed service provider, such as GraVoc, and they're helping you not just set up your environment, but manage it going forward, what's their responsibilities? What are your responsibilities? And very clearly delineating either in a shared responsibility matrix, which a lot of people have, or even in your system security plan, what those different relationships are. And the reason for that is we know who to talk to during the assessment. Are we talking to GraVoc to understand who's doing call it your vulnerability management? Or are we talking to an internal IT asset to understand who's doing vulnerability management? These things are very important as we go through, and those controls can be fully inherited or partially inherited. There's a lot of times that people try to push off fully inherited to somebody, to their managed service provider, and GraVoc may turn around and say, well, we can't do everything. It's still your policy. you need to have the policy that dictates to them how often are they doing vulnerability scanning, for instance, is one way to think of it. So it's when it becomes that shared responsibility. You define it, they do it. Those are very important things to keep an eye on. So a lot of different scoping pieces here we're talking about. I know we could talk about scoping actually for an entire hour, and I don't want to do that. But I do want to kind of get into there's that first thing, very first thing I talked about, which is how do we decide as an organization, do we do that enterprise approach or we do the enclave approach? I've talked about when that kind of breakpoint happens, but that's a little whiles back now for me. Brian, what do you see and how do you help organizations decide when am I going to be enterprise and when am I going to be enclave?
Yeah, thank you very much, Joe. And also, thank you very much for taking the time to join this webinar and have this session with us. Monarch's been a great partner of GraVoc over the years, great relationship between the two organizations, and we're fortunate to have Joe here today. Again, he's the CEO over there. He's their lead assessor. He's CMMC in and out every day. So again, we're very fortunate to have him here as a resource. So thanks for that time. In regards to your question of, enterprise versus enclave, I think, in speaking with the organizations that we've worked with on the readiness side of things, it really gets boiled down to a price decision. And, from my perspective, it really should be more of a strategy than a price decision. When you hear enclave versus enterprise, again, you're talking about your entire organization versus a subset. So people hear subset, and when you think about cost, you think, okay, cheaper, easier, more streamlined. That's partially the case depending on the environment, but really it comes down to what your strategy is going to be around CMMC. It's really how essential is it to your operation. Are you a 15-person manufacturing company that every person in your operation works on CMMC contracts, and that's what you do? Okay, great. You're clearly going to go with an enterprise-wide approach. If you're a much larger organization and you have one department that works on CMMC contracts, that's certainly a different decision. Again, that enclave approach offers some advantages and disadvantages. Again, it is less cost. There will be less user disruption. You have less of a, if you think about it in terms of information security, we talk about attack surface. If you think that enclave will be a smaller attack surface, it'll be a smaller subset compared to your entire organization. So it might be faster. Again, less opportunities for, again, threats to implement that, impact that environment, less user disruption. Again, all your employees are not going to have to comply, just your subset. There's the counterbalance to all of those points that I just made of it's more complex. Now you have two systems. What do you have for the resources internally? If you have internal IT management or even outsourced, now you're essentially going to have two environments that you have to manage if you go with the enclave approach. So again, is your team, mature enough? Are your staff that are going to be operating inside of the enclave and outside of the enclave, is your security operations mature enough that they're going to be able to, handle and, maintain that control in the appropriate environment and then, outside of the environment? Have you scoped, as Joe's, scope is obviously kind of step one. What do you have? Where does it live? Have you properly scoped, or are you going to get halfway down an enclave assessment and realize, oh man, this is maybe not the best approach for us? Of course, if you go the enterprise-wide, you have a uniform security and user experience. The same controls are being applied at the enterprise level. It's applied to all users. That's much more uniform, kind of that broad brush approach of, hey, this is how we're doing things. Again, there could be just as big of a lift there depending on what your security culture and control stack going into this is. Luckily, it's been, since 2021 and, even before that, companies have started to have the CMMC term thrown around and started to think about it and hopefully started to position themselves to be somewhat ready. But for some organizations, it might be a big lift compared to their current operation. So, those are all things that really come into the strategy level of, again, just how critical is CMMC contract business to your business's day-to-day operation. How ingrained is it? How many people? What's the percentage of people, revenue, et cetera, driven by that CMMC, business? And again, how does that fit into your overall operation? So again, If you have a lower percent of users and, less of a budget and, your operational security or maturity might be lower, maybe an Enclave is more appropriate. And again, on the vice versa is true, of course. If most of your business is tied to that CMMC, then you want to go with that enterprise approach. If you do go with the Enclave approach, there will be some specific documentation and boundary justifications. It all starts with your SSP, your system security plan. And the key component of that is basically it's a plan. It's what you're going to do. And just think about that as you're going to document what you're going to do. And from an Enclave perspective, you're going to clearly define where those boundaries are. And it's important to have that well documented because you're essentially going to be tested and audited against that plan. And it's not just going to be, okay, you wrote down everything correctly. It's, hey, have you actually segmented your network correctly? We're going to test, boundary controls, inbound and outbound firewall rules and connections, other, network protocols. Those are all going to be tested to make sure that, that Enclave really is that Enclave and there's not data leakage outside of that. So along with that security plan, you'll have your formal scope and boundary statement, as well as your CUI asset inventory, and then some secondary documents that would support you would be a network and data flow diagram. And then also you might need some secondary documentation. Again, if you're in an Enclave, you might have an incident response plan or a, business continuity plan that's at your enterprise level, but now this Enclave is a different environment. It's going to have a separate plan. You'll need to have separate documents, policies, and procedures that support operation within that Enclave.